Number 1.
It's been almost 100 years since the family on Hinterkaifeck farm was murdered. Over 100 suspects have been interviewed, but the perpetrator, or perpetrators, of the crime remain unidentified. The murder of the family was certainly creepy in and of itself, but there were even more creepy things that happened on the Hinterkaifeck family farm, and we'll get to them in a second. 4 people were found slaughtered in the Hinterkaifeck barn. The other 2 victims were murdered in their beds. If you're the type of person who jumps when they hear things going bump in the night, this article is not the one for you. You'll surely be left sleepless and awake for many nights to come. One of the creepiest things about the Hinterkaifeck farm murders is the fact that the suspects was never found. It's true that since the crime was committed almost 100 years ago, it's safe to say the suspect is dead, but it's still creepy to think what killer legacy they might have passed on to other people. Who might the descendants of the Hinterkaifeck murderers be? Leading up to the Hinterkaifeck murders, father of the family, Andreas Gruber, noticed something strange about a week before his murder. There were footsteps in the snow leading from the woods to his house, but none leading back into the woods. Andreas told neighbors about this, and one neighbor offered to lend Andreas a gun to defend his family with. For whatever reason, Andreas declined. Andreas lived on the farm with his wife Kazilia, their grown daughter Victoria, and their grandchildren Kazilia Jr. and Joseph. It was relatively quiet and safe in the area surrounding Hinterkaifeck farm, so it's possible Andreas convinced himself the footsteps in the snow were nothing to worry about. Something that should have tipped him off, though, was the fact that he'd found a newspaper in the house he'd never bought. Furthermore, several keys had gone inexplicably missing. That's not even all. The Gruber's previous maid had quit 6 months before. She'd claimed the house was haunted because she often heard unexplained noises and voices in the attic. The day that the Grubers were murdered, their new maid, Maria, had just begun her first day. If only Maria had started her new job a day later, she could have saved her life. The Hinterkaifeck murders. One of the eeriest things about the Hinterkaifeck farm murders is the fact that 4 of the victims seemed to have been lured to their deaths. Andreas, Kazilia Sr., Victoria, and Kazilia Jr. were all found butchered to death in the Hinterkaifeck barn. Considering it was the middle of the night, it's logical that each family member was brought there one by one. Maria, however, was killed in her bed, and young Joseph slaughtered in his crib. Investigators believe the family to have been murdered with a farming implement called a mattock. This tool is a sort of pickaxe that has a blade on one side and a pick on the other. Poor Kazilia Jr. was found with clumps of her own hair in her hands, suggesting she was the only one who took a long time to die. Investigators say that Kazilia Jr. might have spent hours lying next to her dead family and writhing in pain. The dead are found on Hinterkaifeck farm. It took about a week for other citizens to really take notice of the missing family. First, Kazilia Jr. didn't show up to school for a few days. Then Sunday came, and the Grubers missed church. Because neighbors saw chimney smoke wafting from the farmhouse, no one was really worried something might be wrong. It wasn't until the mailman noticed fire mail was piling up that people paid a visit and discovered the gruesome scene. The smoke wafting from the house is a key creepy detail because this indicates that whoever murdered the family remained in the house at least a few days after the murders. Investigators even found that farm chores like feeding the animals and milking the cow had been taken care of. Perhaps even more chillingly, the fact that the Gruber's old maid had been frightened by sounds in the night indicates that the killers might have been residing in the house months before their horrific crime. Speculations are made about Hinterkaifeck farm murderers. Even after almost 100 years and 100 interviews, no one is sure about who is responsible for the Hinterkaifeck farm murders. As with most unsolved cases, several theories have been formed. One hair-raising detail not mentioned about the Gruber family yet is the fact that Andreas and his daughter Victoria had been arrested for incest in 1915. It was thought to be an abusive relationship. Victoria served 1 month in prison, and Andreas was sent away for a year. This horrific fact produced 3 theories. One theory stemming from Andreas and Victoria's incestuous relationship is that Victoria's husband had come back after many years and been horrified to see that Victoria had a child with another man. It was thought by many that Joseph was the product of continued incest, so some thought Victoria's husband went ballistic and killed the whole family. This theory broke down when it was revealed that many of her husband's military comrades attested to him being Kia in World War I. They even insisted they had seen his dead body with their own eyes. Another theory stemming from the incest was that maybe Joseph had been the son of a nearby neighbor instead. This neighbor had had a son recently die, so it was postulated that he might have been upset that his child with Victoria was the one that survived. This theory didn't hold a lot of water because it was largely speculative, not to mention this same neighbor was the man who offered Andreas a gun to protect his family. The last theory orbiting Andreas and Victoria's incestuous relationship was that one of them might have committed a murder-suicide. This one was quickly dismissed though, because none of their fatal injuries could have been self-inflicted. There are still some other theories buzzing around about the truth of the Hinterkaifeck farm murders. Most notably, students at a German police academy used modern techniques to try to solve the case. They apparently eliminated all suspects except for one, but refused to release this information to the public since the suspect is already dead anyway. The students thought it more important to protect the privacy of the remaining living family. Where to watch more about the Hinterkaifeck farm murders. A 2009 movie named Kaifeck Murder was inspired by the Hinterkaifeck farm murders. In it, the protagonist is a photographer who has been charged with capturing the ways of the local Bavarian people. He soon discovers that a nearby town was the home of a serial killer.
Number 2.
How did the Chicago Tylenol murders change medicine? There are some cases that people who ever have the vaguest interest in true crime just know: the Zodiac killer, the death of Natalie Wood, the Chicago Tylenol murders. It's the last one that we're talking about today. This 1982 drug tampering crime saw 7 people dead of potassium cyanide, a slew of copycat crimes, and a wave of reform that changed medicine in a big way. More terrifying, however, the Chicago Tylenol murders remain unsolved to this day. While there are suspects, none have officially been charged for the murders of Mary Kellerman, Adam Janis, Stanley Janis, Teresa Janis, Mary McFarland, Paula Prince, and Mary Reiner. As the decades tick by, you have to wonder if this case will be one that'll never get solved. This, of course, doesn't mean that there aren't some good things to come out of all this tragedy. Here's how the Chicago Tylenol murders improved a couple of things. How it was handled. Far be it from us to praise our corporate overlords. But, in 1982, Johnson & Johnson actually put the welfare of the people over, their profit margins. Honestly, this is probably the way everyone should handle their product being used to commit mass murder. After the Chicago Tylenol murders occurred, Johnson & Johnson was honest with the public and transparent about their handling of the situation. There was a massive recall on Tylenol after the murders, where people send in their Tylenol and get a new, unopened bottle of the over-the-counter medication. Johnson & Johnson also formed partnerships with the Chicago Police Department, the FBI, and the FDA in order to investigate the crime. Due to the Chicago Tylenol murders, the market share for Johnson & Johnson dropped from 35% to 8%. Due to their response and handling of the murders, it rebounded in less than a year. After the introduction of the triple-sealed packaging along with some heavy price promotions, Tylenol reclaimed its crown as the best-selling over-the-counter analgesic in the US within several years of the crime. What changed from it? The major change across the pharmaceutical, food, and consumer product industry was the introduction of tamper-proof packaging. Basically, if you buy a product and the seal has been broken on it, then you know that someone has messed with it. Sure, you have wrestled with the bottle for like 20 minutes to get it open, but at least no one else is getting in there either. And that's peace of mind, right? The major change that affects the pharmaceutical side of things came in the introduction of caplets over capsules. Capsules, after all, could be easily taken apart, which is how the poison was placed in the Tylenol that committed the murders. Caplets allowed no seal to be broken. Finally, and legally, product tampering was made a federal crime. This actually helped big time as a slew of copycat poisonings erupted from the Chicago Tylenol murders. The most famous of these cases is the Seattle Excedrin murders, which saw 2 people dead. Under these laws, Stella Nichols was sentenced to 90 years in prison. Anything else? The Chicago Tylenol murders remain one of the white whales of unsolved cases, so to speak. We want to see justice for the deaths of the 7 victims whose lives were so callously taken away by a person who wanted to kill indiscriminately. Due to the changes that arose following the murders, it definitely made things harder for the next mass poisoner to get the job done. Either way, we can only hope that the perpetrator is caught.
Number 3.
More than 24 years later, authorities are still trying to answer that question. Jonbenet's parents initially thought she had been kidnapped during the night. In a 911 call just before 6 a.m., her mother Patsy Ramsey was inconsolable as she told the dispatcher that her daughter was missing and that she'd found a ransom note at the bottom of her stairs. The 3-page-long note said, in part, that if Jonbenet's parents called the authorities, she would die and ask for $118,000. It also said that Jonbenet's parents would receive a call from the supposed kidnapper tomorrow between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. Police arrived shortly after the 911 call and began investigating the scene for clues about the kidnapper. John Ramsey later found Jonbenet in the basement, a part of the home that police had neglected to search. Jonbenet's cause of death was determined to be strangulation with a makeshift garrote, a weapon that, in this case, involved a string wrapped around a piece of one of Patsy Ramsey's paintbrushes. The child had also suffered an 8-inch skull fracture, shocks from a stun gun, and sexual abuse with a broken piece from the paintbrush used in the garrote, according to Brad Garrett, a former FBI agent and ABC News contributor who wasn't involved in Jonbenet's case. A new episode of 2020's will provide new insight into the murder and showcases the exclusive network premiere of the video diaries of legendary detective Lou Smith, who was brought out of retirement to investigate the murder of the child beauty queen. Smith then dedicated his life to proving the Ramsey family's innocence. On his deathbed, he requested his children and grandchildren keep his search for the killer alive. In Smith's video diaries, he reveals his theories about what happened the night Jonbenet died and his belief that DNA will ultimately expose the killer. Along with reporting by 2020's co-anchor Amy Robach, the 2-hour program includes interviews with Lexi Mara and Jessa Van Der Ward, Smith's granddaughters and hosts of the podcast The Victim's Shoes on Jonbenet's death. They open up to 2020's about the list of potential suspects he left behind, his confidence that one of the names on the list is Jonbenet's killer, and how they've made it their family's mission to carry on their grandfather's legacy by trying to solve the case. 2020's also features the first TV interview with John Andrew Ramsey, Jonbenet's half-brother, and archival interviews with the Ramsey family, detectives, and more.
Number 4.
The long-held mystery of the Zodiac killer's murderous rampage in and around San Francisco has been solved. A code-breaking team from the US, Australia, and Belgium has cracked what has become known as the 340 cipher, a message written in code that the notorious killer sent to the San Francisco Chronicle in 1969, at the height of his string of killings. The name of the cipher refers to the number of characters in the puzzle. "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me," the cipher reads in part, according to the Chronicle. The letter writer mentions a TV show. It is not clear in the cipher which show he is referring to, but the Chronicle reported that the cipher was sent to the newspaper on November 8, 1969, a few weeks after a man claiming to be the Zodiac killer called into the Jim Dunbar Show, a local television talk show. The cipher confirms law enforcement officials' suspicions that the caller to the talk show was a fraud, the newspaper reported. "I am not afraid of the gas chamber, because it will send me to paradise all the sooner, because I now have enough slaves to work for me," the puzzle continues. "Where everyone else has nothing when they reach paradise, so they are afraid of death." Hopes were dashed that the cipher would contain the killer's name. The decoding of the cipher is believed to be legitimate for several reasons, according to the Chronicle. The misspelling of the word paradise, thought to be purposeful, was in several of the Zodiac's letters. The killer also repeated the theme of having slaves awaiting him in paradise. In a 1970 letter, he mentioned that he would torture all 13 of my slaves, that I have waiting for me in paradise," the newspaper reported. The Zodiac killer eventually claimed he'd killed more than 30 victims, though investigators have only been able to link him to 5 deaths. The FBI's San Francisco office confirmed the news in a statement Friday. The FBI is aware that a cipher attributed to the Zodiac killer was recently solved by private citizens, the statement read. The Zodiac killer case remains an ongoing investigation for the FBI San Francisco division and our local law enforcement partners. The agency said out of respect for the victims and families, and due to the ongoing nature of the investigation, no further information would be provided. The Zodiac killer terrorized multiple communities across Northern California, and even though decades have gone by, we continue to seek justice for the victims of these brutal crimes, FBI officials said. The self-named Zodiac killer stalked and killed at least 5 people across California's San Francisco Bay Area in 1968 and 1969. His first confirmed victims, David Faraday, 17, and his 16-year-old girlfriend, Betty Lou Jensen, were shot and killed near their car December 20, 1968, on Lake Herman Road near Vallejo. According to Biography.com, Darlene Farron, 22, and Mike Mageau, 19, were sitting in Farron's car July 5, 1969, in a similarly remote spot 4 miles from the previous murder scene. The couple was approached by a man with a flashlight and a gun. The man opened fire, killing Farron and seriously wounding Mageau. Less than an hour later, a man called the Vallejo Police Department and took credit for that attack and the one on Faraday and Jensen, the website said. On August 1, 1969, a letter was sent to the Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Dear Editor, the letter began, according to Biography.com. I am the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman. The missive contained details only the killer could have known, authorities said. He threatened to attack more victims if the letter was not published on the front page of each newspaper. Each envelope contained 1/3 of another cipher, which became known as the 408 cipher. I like killing because it is so much fun, read that cipher, which puzzled police but was later solved by Selena's teacher Donald Hardin and his wife, Betty. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. As detectives from multiple police departments scrambled to identify the killer, he sent another letter to the Examiner in which he first used his moniker. Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac speaking, the letter began, according to Biography.com. Each of the killer's letters bore a symbol. A circle with a cross through it, similar to the crosshairs on a rifle scope. One of the most chilling and brutal crimes attributed to the Zodiac killer was the September 27, 1969, attack on college students Brian Hartnell, 20, and Cecilia Shepard, 22, who were enjoying the day on the shore of Lake Berryessa, 30 miles north of Napa. A man appeared holding a gun and wearing a hooded costume with a white crossed circle stitched over the chest, according to History.com. Explaining that he had escaped from a prison and needed money and a car to escape to Mexico, the stranger bound their wrists with pre-cut lengths of plastic clothesline. Without warning, he plunged a large knife into Brian's back 6 times. The man then stabbed Shepard 10 times, mortally wounding her. Hartnell would survive his injuries. The man then walked to Brian's car and used a pen to draw a crossed circle on the door, with the dates and locations of the previous attacks, the date September 27, 69, the time 6:30 and the notation, by KnifeHistory.com's website states. At 7:40 p.m., a man called the Napa Police Department to report a double murder. The caller described Hartnell's car and gave the dispatcher directions to the crime scene. He also confessed, saying, "I'm the one who did it." The next time police and reporters heard from the Zodiac killer was after the October 11, 1969, shooting of cab driver Paul Stein, 28, in San Francisco. That night, Stein picked up a fare headed for a destination in the upscale Presidio Heights neighborhood. At the intersection of Washington and Cherry Streets, the passenger shot Stein in the head and removed a piece of the victim's shirt, History.com says. The man walked away just before police arrived, but the police radio broadcast mistakenly described the suspect as a black man. Officers speeding by on their way to the crime scene spotted a man fitting the correct description of the killer, But because he was white, they did not stop him. Stein's death was believed to be a robbery until the Chronicle received a letter from the Zodiac killer taking credit. The envelope contained a blood-stained piece of Stein's striped shirt. The killer continued to communicate with police and reporters for years, in one letter threatening to target a school bus and pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. He insinuated that he'd killed many more people, and detectives suspected him in several other cases, but could not prove a link. The letters stopped in 1974. In that final letter, the writer stated that he had recently seen The Exorcist and thought it was the best satirical comedy that he had ever seen. He ended the note with a tally of the murders he claimed he'd committed. Me, 37, SFPD, 0. The killer's identity has been the source of much speculation over the years. Some of the more well-known suspects who have been ruled out include Bruce Davis, a convicted killer who was part of Charles Manson's infamous family, and Theodore Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber. Detectives grew hopeful in 2018 after DNA and genetic genealogy solved the case of the Golden State Killer. They were able to develop a partial genetic profile from a stamp on one of the Zodiac's letters, but because it was incomplete, the profile could not rule anyone in as a suspect, the Chronicle reported. The profile did rule out longtime suspect Arthur Lee Allen. Meanwhile, California detectives and amateur sleuths from across the U.S. have spent decades trying to solve the case. David Aranchak, one of the codebreakers who cracked the long unsolved 340 cipher, told the Chronicle he has been working on the task since 2006. Aranchak is a 46-year-old web designer who lives in Virginia. His teammates were Belgian computer programmer Jarle van Eyck and Sam Blake, an Australian mathematician. "This is exciting," Aranchak told the newspaper. "We've been sitting on the solution since last Saturday. When I first started looking at the Zodiac ciphers all those years ago, I thought, oh, I can just write a computer program and solve it." Aranchak said it wasn't that simple. The code has been kicking his A for 14 years. Until now, he said.
Number 5.
In 22 years plus of doing this job as a news reporter, this is one of those cases that kinda sticks with me, because we know the who, what, when, where. But the why is always the question, said NBC law reporter Lolita Lopez in reference to the mysterious death of Elisa Lam. To this day, nobody knows how exactly Elisa Lam died. We know that the 21-year-old Canadian college student was last seen in the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles on January 31, 2013. But the infamously chilling hotel surveillance video that captured the bizarre final moments before her disappearance, let alone the other details that have emerged since, have only elicited more questions than answers. Ever since her body was discovered in the hotel's water tank on February 19, her tragic demise has remained shrouded in mystery. Although the coroner's office ruled her death as an accidental drowning, the strange details of Lam's case have fueled rampant speculation about what may have really happened. Internet sleuths have come up with a myriad of theories about the tragedy, involving everything from murder conspiracies to evil spirits. But when it comes to the disturbing death of Elisa Lam, where does the truth lie? On January 26, 2013, Elisa Lam arrived in La. She had just come by Amtrak train from San Diego and was headed to Santa Cruz as part of her solo trip around the West Coast. The trip was supposed to be a getaway from her studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, where she was originally from. Her family had been wary of her traveling by herself, but the young student was determined to go at it alone. As a compromise, Lam made sure to check in with her parents every day of the trip to let them know that she was safe. That's why it struck her parents as unusual when they didn't hear from their daughter on January 31, the day she was scheduled to check out of her La Hotel, the Cecil. The Lams eventually contacted the Los Angeles Police Department. The police searched the premises of the Cecil but couldn't find her. Police soon released surveillance footage taken from the cameras at the Cecil Hotel on their website. This is where things took a turn into the truly bizarre. The hotel video showed Elisa Lam in one of its elevators on the date of her disappearance acting rather strangely. In the pixelated footage, Lam can be seen stepping into the elevator and pushing all the floor buttons. She steps in and out of the elevator, poking her head out sideways toward the hotel's hallways in between. She peers out of the elevator another few times before stepping out of the elevator entirely. The last minutes of the video show Lam standing by the left side of the door, moving her hands in random gestures. Nobody else was captured on the video except Lam. Public reaction to the inexplicable video crossed all the way to Canada and China, where Lam's family is originally from. The 4-minute video of Lam's strange elevator episode has amassed tens of millions of views. On February 19, 2 weeks after the video was published by authorities, maintenance worker Santiago Lopez found Elisa Lam's dead body floating in one of the hotel water tanks. Lopez made the discovery after responding to complaints from hotel patrons about low water pressure and a weird taste coming from the tap water. According to a statement by the chief of the Los Angeles Fire Department, the tank in which Lam's body was found had to be drained completely and then cut open from the side to remove her 5'4" frame. Nobody knows how Lam's corpse, floating lifelessly next to the same clothes she wore in the surveillance video, ended up in the hotel's water tank, or who else might have been involved. Hotel staff told authorities that Lam was always seen by herself around the hotel premises. But at least one person did see Lam soon before her death. At a nearby shop, eerily named The Last Bookstore, owner Katie Orphan was among the last to see Elisa Lam alive. Orphan remembered the college student buying books and music for her family back in Vancouver. It seemed like Lam had plans to return home, plans to give things to her family members and reconnect with them, Orphan told CBS Law. When the autopsy results for Lam's case came out, it only served to ignite more questions. The toxicology report confirmed that Lam had consumed a number of medical drugs, likely to be medication for her bipolar disorder. But there were no indications of alcohol or illegal substances in her body. An incomplete autopsy fuels wild theories. Soon after the toxicology report came out, amateur sleuths began poring over any information they could find in hopes of solving the mystery behind the death of Elisa Lam. For example, one summary of Lam's toxicology report was posted online by a Reddit sleuth with an obvious interest in medicine. The breakdown pointed out 3 key observations. 1. Lam took at least one antidepressant that day. 2. Lam had taken her second antidepressant and mood stabilizer recently, but not that day. And 3. Lam had not taken her antipsychotic recently. These conclusions suggested that Lam, who had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression, may have not been taking her medications properly. It is an important finding to note given that the use of antidepressants to treat bipolar disorder can risk inducing manic side effects if done without caution. Some sleuths have understandably latched onto this detail and suggested it was a likely explanation behind Lam's strange behavior in the elevator. Hotel manager Amy Price's statements in court strongly support this theory. During Lam's stay at the Cecil Hotel, Price said that Lam was originally booked in a hostel-style shared room with others. However, complaints of odd behavior from Lam's roommates forced Lam to be moved to a private room by herself. But even if Elisa Lam had been suffering from mental health issues, how did she end up dead? Furthermore, how did she end up in the hotel's water tank? The autopsy did not show any foul play from the evidence that was processed. But the coroner's office noted that they were unable to do a full examination because they could not examine the blood from Lam's decomposing body. Who's responsible for the death of Elisa Lam? David and Yuna Lam filed a wrongful death suit against a Cecil hotel several months after their daughter's death was uncovered. The Lam's attorney stated that the hotel had a duty to inspect and seek out hazards in the hotel that presented an unreasonable risk of danger to Lam and other hotel guests. The hotel fought back against the suit, filing a motion to dismiss it. The hotel's lawyer argued that the hotel had no reason to think that someone would be able to get into one of their water tanks. Based on court statements from the hotel's maintenance staff, the hotel's argument is not entirely far-fetched. Santiago Lopez, who was the first to find Lam's body, described in detail how much effort he had to exert just to find her body. Lopez said that he took the elevator to the 15th floor of the hotel before walking up the staircase to the roof. Then, he had to first turn off the rooftop alarm and climb up on the platform, where the hotel's 4 water tanks were located. Finally, he had to climb another ladder to get to the top of the main tank. Only after all that did he notice something unusual. "I noticed the hatch to the main water tank was open and looked inside and saw an Asian woman lying face up in the water approximately 12 inches from the top of the tank," Lopez said, as reported by Laced. Lopez's testimony suggested that it would have been difficult for Lam to make it to the top of the water tank on her own. At least, not without anyone noticing. The hotel's chief engineer Pedro Tovar also made it clear that it would be difficult for anyone to access the rooftop where the hotel water tanks were located without triggering the alarms. Only hotel employees would be able to deactivate the alarm properly. If it was triggered, the sound of the alarm would reach the front desk as well as the entire top 2 floors of the hotel. Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Howard Hom ruled that the death of Elisa Lam was unforeseeable because it had happened in an area that guests were not allowed to access, so the lawsuit was dismissed. The chilling backstory of the Cecil Hotel. Elisa Lam's mysterious demise was not the first to happen at the Cecil Hotel. In fact, the building's sordid past has earned it a reputation as one of the most supposedly haunted properties in Los Angeles. Since opening its doors in 1927, the Cecil Hotel has been plagued by 16 different non-natural deaths and unexplained paranormal events. The most famous death associated with the hotel, other than Lam's, was the 1947 murder of actress Elizabeth Short, aka the Black Dahlia, who was reportedly seen drinking at the hotel bar in the days before her grisly demise. The hotel has also hosted some of the country's most notorious killers. In 1985, Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, lived on the top floor of the hotel during his monstrous killing spree. The story goes that after a murder, Ramirez would dump his bloody clothes outside the hotel and return half naked. Back then, the hotel was in such disarray that Ramirez's nude stunt barely raised an eyebrow. 6 years later, another murderous patron moved into the hotel, Austrian serial killer Jack Unterweger, who earned the nickname Vienna Strangler. With such a macabre history, one would think that the Cecil Hotel would soon be condemned. But actually, the old building was recently granted landmark status by the Los Angeles City Council. The hotel was given the distinction because of the building's opening back in the 1920s, which is considered the beginning of the lodging industry in the US. Meanwhile, the tragic death of Elisa Lam at the hotel has inspired pop culture adaptations like Ryan Murphy's American Horror Story, Hotel. During a press conference for the show, Murphy stated that the new season was inspired by a surveillance video from a Los Angeles-based hotel that surfaced 2 years ago. The footage showed a girl in an elevator who was never seen again. An obvious reference to Elisa Lam and her bizarre elevator episode. More recently, a gaming studio came under fire after users of the game Zodiac, a postmodern RPG, found undeniable resemblances to Lam's case in the storyline. In one scene of the game, main character Alex receives a video file showing another character, Sammy, in an elevator. The elevator door opens to reveal an alternate dimension on the other side. Sammy is then captured by a demon, kicking and screaming all the while. In a 2016 interview with Waypoint, Andrew Allenson, co-founder of Axe Studios, which is the company behind the Zodiac game, talked about how the death of Elisa Lam had influenced its development, saying that there still hasn't been a great official story about her. "I remember on local news they reported it from the gross out angle because people drank water that a corpse had been floating in. That's unfortunate, but what about the poor girl who died? It's easy to say she was off her meds, but why can't people think a bit more about her as a person?" While an answer to the mystery behind the death of Elisa Lam remains unclear, the obsession surrounding that mystery has remained in the public consciousness ever since.
Number 6.
Wall Street bombing of 1920. Bombing that struck Wall Street in New York City on September 16, 1920, killing 38 people and injuring hundreds more. No group claimed responsibility for the crime, which remains unsolved. About noon on September 16, as Wall Street clerks, receptionists, and brokers were heading for lunch, a horse-drawn cart exploded in front of the offices of J.P. Morgan and Company at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets in downtown New York City. 30 people were killed instantly, more than 300 were injured, and 8 later died from their injuries. The noise was heard throughout Lower Manhattan and across the East River in Brooklyn. The smoke-filled streets were covered with a layer of shattered glass, debris from the damaged buildings, and bodies. The chief clerk of J.P. Morgan, William Joyce, who had been seated near the front window, was among those killed, and Junius Morgan, a son of J.P. Morgan Jr., was wounded. The New York Stock Exchange, across Broad Street, was closed immediately. The police and soldiers called in from Governor's Island helped the injured, guarded the scene, and searched for evidence. The investigation ultimately confirmed that a bomb made with TNT and packed with iron window sash weights had caused the carnage and that it had been detonated by a timer after the perpetrators left the scene. Because nobody claimed responsibility for the bombing, the New York Police Department considered a number of possible motives. The assassination of J.P. Morgan Jr. was dismissed as a motive because he was in Europe at the time of the attack. Another possibility was an attempt to rob the adjacent sub-treasury building, where $900 million in gold bars was being moved that day. The bombing was ultimately decided to have been an act of terrorism performed by Reds, anarchists and communist sympathizers who wanted to shatter the symbols of American capitalism. A stack of anarchist flyers found in a mailbox a block away from Wall Street supported this theory. Suspicion fell on political radicals, communists, and anarchists of foreign origin, particularly Italians, Russians, and Jews. Although detectives visited every sash weight manufacturer and dealer in the United States, as well as 500 stables in towns along the Atlantic coast, they had no success in finding the perpetrators. One suspect was Edwin P. Fisher, a lawyer, champion tennis player, and frequent inpatient in mental hospitals. In correspondence with friends and in conversations with strangers, he had predicted an explosion on Wall Street in mid-September. On September 16, however, he was in Canada, and his premonition was interpreted by investigators as a delusion that came true by coincidence. Another suspect was an Italian, Pietro Angelo, who was connected to a 1919 bomb plot. Pietro produced an alibi, but he was deported to Italy nonetheless. The Secret Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation interrogated thousands of people and arrested many radicals, but no one was charged with the crime, and the investigation was dropped in 1940. No memorial was created to commemorate the event, and the facade of the damaged building at 23 Wall Street was not repaired. Conspiracy theories were abundant, but the New York Police and Fire Departments, the Bureau of Investigation, the FBI's predecessor, and the U.S. Secret Service were on the job to find out the truth. Each lead was actively pursued, and the Bureau interviewed hundreds of people who had been around that area before, during, and after the attack, but collected very little information. The few recollections of the driver and wagon were vague and useless. The NYPD was able to reconstruct the bomb and its fuse mechanism, but there was much debate about the nature of the explosive. However, the most promising lead had actually come prior to the explosion. A mailman had found 4 crudely spelled and printed flyers in the Wall Street area from a group calling itself the American Anarchist Fighters that demanded the release of political prisoners. The letters seemed similar to ones used the previous year in 2 bombing campaigns which were led by Italian anarchists. The Bureau investigated up and down the East Coast to trace the printing of these flyers, but they were unsuccessful. Based on bomb attacks over the previous decade, the Bureau initially suspected followers of the Italian anarchist Luigi Gallini had committed the crime. But the case couldn't be proved, and Gallini had already fled the country. Over the next 3 years, hot leads turned cold and promising trails turned into dead ends. In the end, the bombers were not identified.
Number 7.
At around 10 a.m. on January 15, 1947, Betty Bersinger was pushing her daughter in a stroller through the Leimert Park section of South Los Angeles when something caught her eye amid the weedy, vacant lots. A naked female body, severed at the waist, was lying just off the sidewalk, the stark whiteness of her skin offset by jet black hair and deformities like the gashes carved from each side of her mouth. Bersinger dashed to a neighbor's house to call the police, igniting a frenzy that engulfed several divisions of the LAPD and reporters from the city's relentlessly competitive newspapers and laid the groundwork for what became one of the country's most famous unsolved cases. Her identity was determined with help from an early fax machine. An autopsy found that the victim had perished from repeated blows to the face and the subsequent blood loss, the torso's bisection and other mutilations, at least, coming after she was already dead. As for her identification, an editor at the Examiner suggested sending fingerprints via the paper's Synphoto, an early fax machine, to an office in Washington, D.C., where they could be relayed to the FBI. By the evening of January 16, authorities had matched the prints to those of 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, who previously worked at an army base in California and once been arrested for underage drinking. A phone call to Short's mother in Massachusetts brought more information about her background, while inquiries in nearby Long Beach uncovered the hook that became a staple of the front pages. The victim was known among acquaintances there as the Black Dahlia, a nod to her taste for black dresses and the previous year's crime film The Blue Dahlia. The killer taunted investigators by mailing his victims personal items, seemingly making headway in the case. Investigators apprehended married salesman Robert Red Manley, who met Short in San Diego and dropped her off at LA's Biltmore Hotel on January 9, the date of her last sighting. Manley later identified one of the victim's shoes and a purse found near the crime scene, but his alibis otherwise checked out and he was cleared of wrongdoing. In late January, an envelope labeled with cut-out words and the phrase "Heaven is here" arrived at the Examiner's office. Inside was a collection of Short's personal documents, including her birth certificate, social security card and an address book featuring the name Mark Hansen on the cover. Police tracked down approximately 75 men from the book, most of whom had only briefly met its owner, as well as Hansen, a successful nightclub owner. Hansen confirmed that Short had crashed at his home, an explanation that fit in with her developing profile as a drifter who relied on the sympathy of others, and he was also soon crossed off the suspect list. Meanwhile, authorities found themselves sifting through copycat letters from the alleged killer, listening to bogus confessions and following up on other crimes that were potentially related, including the red lipstick murder of February 1947, but inevitably found themselves back at square one. A botched attempt to force a confession led to a grand jury investigation. A new lead emerged the following year when former LA resident Leslie Dillon, then living in Florida, contacted the police department about an acquaintance who may have murdered Short. Believing Dillon to be the actual killer with a split personality, LAPD psychiatrist Dr. Joseph Paul de River lured him west and had members of the department's notorious gangster squad detain him to extract a confession. The decidedly illegal ploy was exposed when Dillon managed to sneak a note about his predicament out a window. However, while his supposed imaginary suspect friend turned out to be quite real and innocent. The mishap prompted Dillon's lawsuit against the city and the launch of a 1949 grand jury investigation, which examined the efforts of law enforcement and the still inconclusive evidence. The jury disseminated without indicting a suspect, and by the following year, the Short mystery was cast adrift into the netherworld of cold cases. The murder became a popular literary topic. While its files were collecting dust, the Black Dahlia saga took on new life in the literary world. John Gregory Dunn's True Confessions, 1977, loosely based on the murder, was followed by James Ellroy's The Black Dahlia, 1987, the fictional but compelling accounts of these and other works bolstering some unflattering myths about Short's personal life. A new crop of writers soon emerged to reveal their personal connections to the case, starting with Janice Knowlton's largely panned Daddy Was the Black Dahlia Killer, 1995. Former LAPD detective Steve Hodel presented a more convincing argument in Black Dahlia Avenger: The True Story, 2003, after discovering that his father, George, had been a suspect in the case. Fellow researcher Larry Harnish poked holes in his assessments, however, and Hodel's credibility took a hit when he also claimed that his dad was the Zodiac killer. British author Pugh Eatwell later took a stab at cracking the case with 2017's Black Dahlia, Red Rose, which revisited the evidence against Dillon and the possibility of an LAPD cover-up. With Hodel and Harnish among those who contested its findings, the book confirmed that the holy grail of noir mysteries would continue to generate controversy, reeling in a fascinated public even as it resisted all efforts to extract a definitive resolution.